as it's supposed to start, so. Mic check, testing, 1 2 1 2 test. Testing, 1 2 1 2 test. Testing, perfect.
Good afternoon, bienvenue, miigwech, for being here on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Il y a 3 semaines, depuis la communauté à Cat Lake a déclaré un état d'urgence à cause de la crise de moisissure dans leur communauté. Et aujourd'hui, finalement, le gouvernement a envoyé des fonctionnaires. Ce n'est pas acceptable. Le manque d'urgence de ce gouvernement en réponse de la crise à Cat Lake est un symbole de le manque d'intérêt de ce gouvernement concernant la crise de moisissure partout les communautés dans la Nord. We are now 3 weeks into the crisis in Cat Lake, and the mold contamination in that community is so severe that 75% of the homes need to be immediately demolished. And the other homes are in bad shape as well. What concerns us is that Cat Lake is a symbol of the disinterest and failures of that Department of Indigenous Services year in, year out to deal with the serious issues of deteriorating homes, mold, and the health impacts it has on families, particularly children and elders who have to be medevaced out, who are suffering, and in some cases, who've died as a result of this contamination. We know, and we are releasing today the information we got from the department, which is completely incomplete in terms of showing the extent of the mold contamination, but what we have still, these numbers are shocking. The majority of communities across this country are affected by mold. What the government does not bother to track is the extent of the mold crisis. So in some of our communities, I can tell you in Saskatchewan, we've had mold in home after home after home. We've seen it in Fort Albany. We've seen it in Cat Lake. We've seen it in Pekanjikam. You name the community, we see children getting sick. We see homes deteriorating. And the federal government's response has been completely inadequate, promising, they always throw big numbers. The numbers always sound impressive. If you look at the numbers that they're promising for Indigenous homes over 10 years, it amounts to less than 1 house per year per community. And in Cat Lake, right now, we need 87 new homes. So where is that going to come from? We're calling on the federal government today to recognize the crisis of mold contamination in the communities. We need an immediate plan, a task force to actually start to gather the data on how serious this issue is. And we're calling on the Prime Minister and Minister Philpott, who's at Treasury Board, who should understand this file because she's certainly overseen it, to put in place in the next federal budget the monies that are necessary to get a credible housing plan for Indigenous communities across Canada and particularly across the North.
Well, I'm proud to join my colleagues in the NDP, Charlie Angus, Romeo Saganash, Georgina Jolebois, in calling for immediate federal action when it comes to the housing crisis on First Nations in Canada. Where I come from, in northern Manitoba, we are talking about a severe housing crisis. 85% of First Nations in Manitoba report serious mold issues in the homes in their communities, and I've seen it firsthand. I've seen the impact of mold in terms of children's rashes. I've talked to elders who are sick because of the bad air that exists in their homes. I've heard from countless families about how the overcrowding in their homes leads to mold contamination, leads to health and social impacts. We are talking about Canada, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and yet the First Peoples live in despicable conditions. Many call them third world living conditions. And the reality is that this housing crisis didn't just happen. It is a direct result of chronic underfunding of First Nations year after year under Liberal and Conservative governments. Enough is enough. Right now, northern Manitoba, like much of Canada, is going through a deep freeze. Parts of my riding, it was -50 with the wind chill over the last few days and last night. There are people that are going to outhouses. There are people that don't have running water. And there are people that are forced to stay in their mold-contaminated homes because they have nowhere to go. Our message to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is if you really mean to talk about reconciliation, and unfortunately we've seen many signs that he doesn't actually know what reconciliation means, but start by dealing with the housing crisis on First Nations. Start by listening to our call for an immediate task force and proceed right away with your team, with Minister Philpott, with Minister O'Regan, in bringing about immediate funding to address the urgent situation, the crisis that exists in First Nations, in Manitoba, and across the country. Thank you.
Thank you to my colleagues. Merci trop. Many residents in northern Saskatchewan, on reserve as well as off reserve, there is a population of Indigenous people who are off reserve. Both provincial and federal government must do more for housing throughout northern Saskatchewan. Residents throughout the whole northern Saskatchewan, be it on reserve or off reserve, has stopped reporting mold because they have this attitude that nothing will get done. Unfortunately, the governments have proven over the years that nothing is getting done. And with nothing getting done, people are in the situation that they're living with mold, have no running water, have no electricity, and the babies, the children, and the families are exposed to all kinds of conditions. There has to be more, and there has to be a very good plan suitable for Northern and First Nations, Northern communities and First Nation communities. Thank you.
Bonjour et merci de votre présence. Vous savez, depuis les 7 dernières années, plus que 7 ans et demi maintenant, j'ai voyagé à travers ce pays pour constater le manque de logement qui existe, cette urgence de manque de logement qui existe à travers le pays. Dans toutes les communautés que j'ai visitées, et j'en ai visité la plupart au pays, dans toutes les communautés, l'item numéro 1 sur l'agenda de ma rencontre avec les chefs et les conseils a toujours été le logement. C'est une préoccupation constante qui a été négligée pendant trop longtemps maintenant. Donc, il faut agir aujourd'hui. Ce n'est pas la première fois que j'en parle avec mes collègues de cette situation. Il y a plus d'1 an, le premier ministre a déclaré, je cite, « Le droit au logement est un droit humain et tout le monde mérite un chez-soi sûr et abordable. » Fin de la citation. C'est le premier ministre qui a dit ça. Le printemps dernier, nous avons présenté dans la Chambre une motion sur le logement en tant que droit humain que les libéraux ont rejeté. Nous avons constaté que 90 % du financement de la stratégie nationale du logement des libéraux ne seront versés qu'après les prochaines élections et probablement après une autre étude. Une autre étude qui va probablement mériter un autre comité d'études pour étudier la faisabilité des recommandations de l'étude précédente. C'est comme ça marche avec les libéraux. Chaque jour qu'un enfant vit dans une maison inadéquate, pleine de moisissures et nécessitant des réparations, doit être considéré comme une honte nationale en ce pays. Un des plus riches de la planète, membre du G7, plein de ressources qui appartiennent aux Autochtones en passant, et on n'a même pas les moyens de contribuer à cette situation. Le logement est également un droit issu de traités reconnus. Par exemple, dans la Convention de la baie James et du Nord québécois, le chapitre 28 et le chapitre 29 de la Convention de la baie James reconnaît, ce premier traité moderne, reconnaît que le Canada et le Québec ont une obligation envers les Cris et les Inuits. Et pourtant, dans ma circonscription, il manque plus de 3500 unités. Dans ma propre circonscription, qui est considérée riche en termes autochtones pour les Cris et les Inuits, il manque 3500 unités. Je pense que si on considérait la liste d'attente pour une maison dans ma communauté, je n'aurais pas ma maison au rythme qu'on construit la maison dans ma communauté. Je n'aurais pas ma maison avant l'âge de 82 ans. Imaginez. Les conventions des Nations unies stipulent que les peuples autochtones ont un droit à un logement sans discrimination. Et on a ce droit par rapport aux autres Canadiens en passant. Il faut rappeler que ce gouvernement a ses obligations internationales en droit de la personne. Ils ne sont pas facultatifs. Si ce gouvernement veut être honorable envers les peuples autochtones, il doit respecter les normes qu'il a choisies au niveau international, au niveau constitutionnel et au niveau des droits de la personne. Merci.
Are you asking for them, like, to gather data on the mold issue, or, like, does this just speak to the broader housing thing, like, just knock out the houses if they're moldy anyway and put in some better ones? Like, what is your ask here?
Well, there's two really important points, and it's one thing to really understand about how the Department of Indigenous Services and Indian Affairs, still to me it's the old department, they just changed the name, how they operate. They're a black hole. They don't keep data, and they don't keep data for a reason, because if they kept data, they'd be accountable. So they stopped keeping data on fire deaths. Why? Well, you know, when we have fire tragedies, the minister says, oh, Jay, what a tragedy. It's too bad we don't have any data. The data that we see on the mold, they're certainly tracking it, but they're not tracking in any credible manner to put a response in. So a task force needs to be in place to get a sense of the extent. What we see on the ground is overwhelming. But we also say to the Prime Minister, in light of a conversation that's happening across this country on the housing, the urgency for housing strategy, whatever we're seeing in cities and communities across the nation is serious, but what we're seeing in Indigenous communities is elevated 1,000 times. And this level of discrimination cannot be allowed to continue in 2019. So we're asking the Prime Minister, what is his plan to put a credible financial plan in place to address the massive backlog? Because the communities are growing year in, year out, and every dollar that the government puts in doesn't actually even keep up with the gap that's there, let alone address the crisis. So we need a sense of urgency on this.
The task force, in terms of, you know, how many members, do you have a vision of what you would like it to look like, or how long a potential study can take from the task force? We are a certain number of months out from an election. What do you kind of envision in terms of timeline and structure?
Well, our colleagues, we've certainly been very concerned about this, because we do not like to give government an opportunity to study anything more in Indigenous country, because it means it'll never happen. But given the fact that the department is failing, and the department has been failing since 2003. The Auditor General pointed out in 2003 this was a crisis. The government said they'd have a response. The response was by 2008 telling people, you know, to clean their walls, which is such a classic racist attitude of Indigenous services, because if you walk into any community, in any of the northern communities, you will smell the bleach and the cleanliness, because the Kukums and family members are trying to keep the homes clean. They know how to keep their homes clean. They just have no resources to do it. So we need some data. We need better than saying, well, 85% of the communities in Manitoba, and in those 85% of those communities, how many houses are in really serious shape, how many should be demolished, how many can be repaired. Without that data, we can't move forward. But that's the first part. But the larger obligation is the federal government putting the financial money on the table and saying they're going to see that there's a housing crisis in this country.
I appreciate before having the data, it's difficult to determine what the actual amount of money required is. But is there any sense of how much money should be spent at this point?
Yeah, the department says the estimate is a shortfall of $8.2 billion. So if that's the department's numbers, they must be getting that number from someplace. So we would say 8.2, that's probably a good starting figure. Let's ask the department to bring forward the numbers to how they arrived at that, because we have other numbers that put the shortfall between 3 to 5 billion. But given the fact that what the government has promised is less than $200,000 a year per community, is literally buys you, in some communities, not even a house. So it would suggest to us that the government has done some number crunching, so let's put those numbers on the table and give us a credible plan that we can actually work with.
If I can also add, I mean, we all know that every single First Nation has a list of a waiting list for housing. I mean, Romeo, you talked about when you're going to get your house, when you're the way they're going when you're 82. And so every community knows exactly what they need. The question is, what is Indigenous Services doing? To what extent are they ignoring the voices on the ground? And I would say, for us, it was very critical that on the first week back that we make this call because, here we are, first week back, new parliament. We are demanding a new commitment on the eve of the next budget with a Treasury Board minister that we understands this file. So we want to see that commitment right around the corner. First Nations deserve it and they demand it.
I also want to add, when we say First Nations and we're talking about families, these are real people. These are our friends, our grandmas and grandpas. Well, where I come from, these are the people that I will relate to and resonate with because I live among them. These are people. Mm-hmm. When the Prime Minister speaks about the most important relationship is with Indigenous people, and yet he's not quick enough to respond to emergency situations, that is very sad. To me, he's just uttering words, and he doesn't mean it. If he means it, he will act on these things.
I want to also say, because we don't quite believe the numbers that have been given to us in terms of what the government has and what the government doesn't have. One of the real twisted, people in my region see as kind of twisted joke, is the department is always telling the band, you need to go in and you need to assess every home, and then we'll put a housing plan in place. So in our communities that I represent, people will have the inspectors come in and they'll think, wow, finally we're going to get a house. And then nothing happens. And people say, what happened with all this information? So the government is collecting it. The government knows in each of the communities what the shortfall is. And yet when we ask what the mold contamination is, which they are collecting and Health Canada is collecting, the best they can do is give us by general numbers of communities, but not the percentages. So where is that data and why is the government not acting on it?
The approach to First Nations housing, because I think it was one of the 5 things that Minister Philpott had sort of laid out when she made her priorities. I know that the National Housing Strategy intentionally didn't include reserves because they said we need to look at it separately from urban issues. There was that contest sort of thing to partner. I know it's not an NDP thing to partner with the private sector that way, but have you guys seen more? Are you being told about a timeline? Like, what's the status of that pledge?
The timeline that I keep hearing is over 10 years. That's so ridiculous. Over 10 years of what? They want us Indigenous people to wait for the government to act 10 years later. By then, how many grandmas would have passed away? How many mums and dads would have moved on? And to move into someone else's home where it's better than what they have.
I think what's also important to say is that, when you look at Indigenous affairs and how they build houses, they sort of build 3 basic models: really, really crappy, medium crappy, and just crappy. Homes that start to fall apart the minute the contractors leave the communities. Homes that were not built with proper foundations, with proper weeping tiles to withstand the extreme temperatures that many of the communities we represent are in. And yet each of us has met countless times with planners, designers, people who actually want to talk about how to build good housing, smart housing. These plans, there's so many innovative strategies for housing, and yet they seem to sit on the desks at Indigenous Services. We have very few good examples of communities actually being able to take control and establishing housing that will last in the long term. So part of the problem we've seen with this government is we saw so much talk, so much warm promises that we expected in 2016 we would start to see the rollout of innovation, of planning, of saying let's start to do things outside the Indigenous Affairs Services box. But here we are 4 years in, and we are in the pretty much the same box we were in with the previous government and the previous government before that. And the communities, the level of frustration is extremely high because people are saying, what happened to these promises? Because I can tell you in the communities I'm in, I'm not seeing much more in the way of housing than we saw under the previous government, and we're certainly not seeing an innovative strategy to housing.
Is that not part of the pilot, though? Like, that they wanted innovative strategies? Like, I don't know the latest. Maybe you guys...
Well, I mean, you know, like, they do these, you know, it seems like this is a government that loves buzzwords, right? Deliverology. Well, you talk to any community on the ground, they know what they need. They know how to deliver it. They know what needs to be delivered. And yet we got this long pilot project that we're going to try this, and communities have to compete with one another. They shouldn't have to compete with one another for ideas. They've got the ideas. What they don't have is the funding. So the government spun this idea, well, we want to, you know, we want to have a really smart plan. What the smart plan is always, it's after the next election. We need action now, and we could be building really sustainable homes in any community if the community actually had the resources and the power to start saying, we want to move, we want to make this happen, and we'll move forward. And I mean, any of us can give you 1,000 examples of the insane roadblocks that the department puts up against even getting a couple of houses built. So deliverology ain't delivering squat in the communities we represent.
If any of you can... Did I cut you off? I'm curious if any of you can make a comparison with Métis communities and settlements in any of your ridings, because, you know, they fall under mostly provincial systems. Do they have the same housing issues? Are the provinces sort of doing more than the feds are on reserve?
I can only speak to my province, which is Saskatchewan. I'm glad you asked that very important question. There's one municipality in my riding. There are about 30 homes boarded up. So there are 30 families who were evicted from their homes, and they're homeless. And how they're surviving? By going to families' home. So we're talking overcrowdedness in the existing system. The province of Saskatchewan have stopped funding housing. So there is no strategy in Saskatchewan. There are no new homes being built. And so in the municipality side, we are seeing an increase in problems with homes as well as homelessness.
I'm wondering if I can specifically ask you about Cat Lake, because there was a meeting that was supposed to happen yesterday with senior officials and leadership on the ground that was delayed due to weather. It's supposed to happen today. What are your expectations for the meeting today?
Well, I'm growing increasingly concerned because we have a community that is a disaster zone, and this disaster did not just happen. The community has attempted for years to get the regional bureaucracy to start moving, but again, without a funding envelope, we get Band-Aids and promises. So right now, we're looking at probably 90 out of 120 homes that need immediate demolition. We have the engineering reports. These are in such bad shape they cannot be fixed in any capacity. 100% of the homes are at serious risk of fire or electrical fire. That's 100%. This is the independent engineering reports. I can pass them to you if you're interested. So you have an immediate crisis. So what we need is as a plan with a team on the ground, we need to probably move up about 80 to 100 emergency trailers up the winter road. Well, we don't have not much time on that winter road. So the minister's had 3 weeks. I mean, he called the chief. Well, that's nice. But this is his test of leadership. A crisis of this needs someone to take command, because we're having children medevaced out now. We had just had a child medevaced out to London. When children are getting sick because the conditions are that bad, I would think in a country like Canada, you know, a minister would give a shit and say, oh my God, I have to get there. I have to meet with the community. He doesn't, I don't think, understand just how severe it is. So I'm hoping that we will see the plans on the ground. But we're going to need ground heaters. We're going to need generators. We're going to need holding tanks. We're going to need sewage trucks. We're going to need plans to start laying out where we're going to move the emergency homes. You know, we've been down this rodeo a number of times with the department. They're not strangers to the crisis that's happened under their watch. So the longer we wait with this minister, the more difficult it's going to be and the more people are going to get sick.
Obviously a very different community, but this reminds me very much of reporting on the Attawapiskat crisis, which you were very vocal about a number of years ago, with especially the push to bring in refabbed homes into the community. I'm wondering, does this remind you at all of that particular situation? And are there any lessons to be learned from what happened in Attawapiskat?
I think
it's a very different community.
It is a very different community, but there's some really disturbing similarities. In the case of Attawapiskat, when I first approached the minister and asked him to send in officials just to meet, they waited 30 days. And at that point, the temperatures dropped to minus 45 and minus 50, and that's when the Red Cross came in. So we are now 10, 15 days since the community asked for the minister, and the temperatures are at minus 50. The delays in response are really concerning. That, to me, is very similar to what happened in Attawapiskat. Now, certainly, Stephen Harper did not help the situation by trying to play the politics of blame with the community. It just delayed things further. But you need to have a really strong plan in place because people are at risk. The elders can't stay in homes at minus 50 where the mold is that bad because people get sick. Where do we move people? The community's talking about whether people have to be moved out to the trap lines because their cabins are safer than their homes. Given the risk of fire, you need, like we had Red Cross going independently of the government. So I would like to see that the minister would say, oh my God, yeah, you're right, we're going to get a plan in place. But we haven't seen that. I mean, what he said yesterday was that they've made enormous strides. Enormous strides on what? Like, we need more than jargon. And so that is very eerily similar to Attawapiskat. And I would think any government would learn from a catastrophe like Attawapiskat that when you have a problem, you deal with it, and you don't wait till it becomes a crisis. But this is the MO of Indian Affairs. You're
calling, obviously, what's going on in Cat Lake a crisis. Is there a chance that the Red Cross could be called in this instance?
I'm going to be speaking with the community after. We'll see what happens with the regional officials. But, this is Canada. And Canada seems to have an enormously thick skin when it comes to the suffering of Indigenous people in our own country. Like, how can we have a community with 75% of the homes are so bad they have to be immediately demolished? This is a complete failure of social infrastructure that we're dealing with in a community that does not have the resources to address this. So I want to just hear some passion and urgency from the government that they're going to move on that. I think all the communities in the north are expecting that because any of the communities we represent are looking at Cat Lake and saying, yeah, in every one of our communities, we have situations just like Cat Lake. If they're not going to fix Cat Lake, how can we even imagine that they're going to come into all the other communities where you have local and neighborhood-style Cat Lakes happening? So we need this government to show that they're going to move.
Last question.
Nikki, I was. Can you just walk me through the 10 years you've represented this riding? Has the housing thing changed? Is it stagnant? I know the population's gone up. And as a side note, the Métis question: is there any comparison to be made with?
Sure. Well, first I would say if you're talking to people on the ground on First Nations, what I hear most often, especially now, is things are getting worse. Things are getting worse because the community is growing. We're talking about the youngest population in the country, one of the youngest regions in the country, and the demands on housing, on services is growing. And yet the housing stock is stagnant. The investments are not taking place the way they need, and as a result, the pressure on the system is becoming greater, and things are getting worse. Objectively, you see the way in which I've visited homes that I'll visit a year later that are experiencing more wear and tear. You're hearing from families. Now we were 12 people in a house. Now we're 17. We've got nowhere to go. As an example of the Indigenous Services Department's failure, just a couple of weeks ago, the CBC aired nationally a story about Garden Hill. The focus was on running water. Here's a community that doesn't have a boiled water advisory, and yet many of the homes do not have access to clean water because of the lack of infrastructure, including housing. And in response to this story, a few days later even, Indigenous Services said they're looking into it. This is one of the communities that almost 10 years ago went through the H1N1 crisis, where people were before, people died from the flu because of the kinds of living conditions they're exposed to. And so, I think our message here today, and anybody who has visited a First Nation that is struggling with housing issues, which is almost all First Nations at this point, ought to know that that things aren't getting better. We're hearing that they're getting worse. It's 2019. We're hearing from a government that keeps using the right kind of language, and yet their actions don't follow up with that language. And where I come from, talk is cheap. What people expect is action, an end to the housing crisis now. I would say that I think it depends on how the provincial governments are prioritizing housing. Housing in Métis communities or Northern Affairs communities, as they're known in Manitoba, has gone through a few different models under the MMF, under the province. So there have been challenges, but for the most part, we're not seeing the same kinds of pressures as on reserve at all. But there again, we need to see the federal government step in and commit to housing in northern communities more broadly, but recognizing, the immediate crisis that exists on too many First Nations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I did. I was hoping.